Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, Episode 52, Part 1.
Over time, I've kind of developed an idea that one of the things that I really care about is relevance, the relevance of school in the modern world. And I think that in many cases, schools are running the risk of becoming just complete dinosaurs.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Fraser Speirs. Fraser is a well-known public speaker at events such as the Apple EU Leadership Summit, Albany Christian University Connected Summit, and Macworld Mobile. He regularly works with schools around the world focusing on next-generation educational technology, teaching practice, and curriculum. Welcome, Fraser.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is fun. Before we start, do you want to briefly tell us about yourself, maybe what your family's like, your hobbies, passion, and of course we want to hear about your profession.
Yeah, so I'm married with 3 daughters, and those girls, April is 10, and Beth is 8, and then Georgia is just 2. So we've got a good range of ages there, each with their own interests and challenges. I've been married to my wife for 15 years now.
Oh, wow.
And
congratulations.
we get married pretty young, so we're still going. We're not done yet. My background is I was born and brought up in the town where I now live, which is called Greenock, in the west of Scotland. It's about 25 miles to the kind of west of Glasgow. And I work at Cedars School of Excellence, which is a small independent school in the town. And in terms of my hobbies and so on, I've only recently started developing hobbies again. I feel I've been kind of racing so hard in work and career and things like that for a few years, but I play the bass guitar, which is one of my interests. And I also have recently, in the past couple of weeks, started learning to play the piano.
Oh, cool.
So trying to get a bit more musical.
Yeah, that's fun. My son plays the guitar, so he's very musical. I'm not at all. So that's awesome. So what was your personal educational experience? And we were kind of talking, I don't know much about what the educational climate is like in the in Europe. Do you want to kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, so telling you about Europe as a whole it would take up the whole of the rest of the podcast. But let me tell you about Scotland and England as 2 components of the UK. In Scotland, we have 2 phases of education, not 3 like in the US. So we have primary and secondary education. And primary education starts at 5 years old, which you would call kindergarten, and it goes for 7 years. So we call it primary 1 through primary 7, and you would call it K through 6th, I suppose. And then we have a secondary system, which is 6 years of secondary education. So you have secondary 1 through 6. And the way that assessment works in Scotland is that you would sit in secondary 4, you would sit a set of exams, which we call national exams. And then the year after, you would sit another set of exams called higher exams. And those higher exams, the results you get in those exams, basically determine your entry into university or not, as the case may be. So that's kind of the way that the system is structured. The curriculum that we follow, that I'll probably refer to a few times in the podcast, is called the Curriculum for Excellence. And it's been rolling out through Scottish education for about 10 years. We just last year, we did the first round of these new national exams. And these exams are supposed to line up more precisely with the goals of Curriculum for Excellence. And then the higher exams have been revamped as well to supposedly match that as well. So we're kind of coming to the end of a big curriculum reform in Scotland. And our school is an independent school, or you might call it a private school. We call it independent school in Scotland. And what that means is that we don't receive any money from the government. All our funding is through parent fees, tuition fees. But we do follow the Scottish curriculum model. We're not obliged to, but we choose to because we think it's most appropriate for our area. There are some schools in Scotland who follow the English model, which is called GCSE, General Certificate of Secondary Education, and A-levels. But the majority of schools in Scotland, state-run or private, follow the Curriculum for Excellence.
Oh, wow. Kind of like what we have here. It's different in the fact that you have to take an exam to decide if you go to university. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
You would actually take a number of them. So you would typically sit at most 5, unless you were an exceptional genius. The maximum number would normally be 5 different subjects. So you would typically sit English and maths and 3 other subjects in your fifth year of secondary school. And you can do more in your 6th year. So there's a year after you sit those major exams. And depending on how many of those you get and what grades you get, determines which universities you can go to.
Oh, wow.
And which subjects. So if you want to be a doctor, for example, in Scotland, you're going to have to show up with at least 5 A grade passes in your 5th year, plus a whole lot of more in your 6th year, because it's a very demanding course and it's in very high demand to get entry into that course. So it's some courses are much more difficult, much more demanding to get into than others. Others you might need 3 B passes higher, or 2 Bs and a C, different things like that. And also different universities demand different levels of qualification as well. So a university that's very popular would demand a very high level just because they can. And a university that's trying to recruit more people to come to that university would offer a lower level. And that's up to the university admissions people themselves. It's not set by the government, or it's not standardized across the country.
All right. Well, it sounded like it was kind of a government standardized thing, but you're just saying that some of these universities, they just, they demand certain scores to be able to even enter into them.
Yeah.
Which is a lot like the US. So that's cool.
So the exams are set by the government, or by a government agency called the Scottish Qualifications Agency. So if everybody sits the same higher English exam, for example, and then the universities that decide how many of those hires and sometimes in which subject. So if you want to go to, say, a chemistry course, you might have had to pass chemistry at higher in school in order to get considered for that course. So every university subject has its own requirements as well.
Wow, that's neat. So why did you choose to teach kind of in an alternative setting versus like the traditional public schools that you have there?
Yeah, I think perhaps the main thing is that I've in my entire life, I've never really enjoyed working in big teams or in big organizations. I just have never enjoyed that feeling of being a very small part of a very big organization and having to go through multiple layers of jockeying and tactics and persuasion in order to get something done. I've always kind of gravitated towards situations and organizations where I could act more directly. And when you work in a small school, and we have 16 teachers in the school and 101 pupils at the moment, you get a chance to act very directly on a lot of things. And I wear many more hats than a normal teacher would in a school. So in many cases, a teacher in a school would maybe, they would teach their subject and they would maybe have one other responsibility, let's say. But I teach my subject. My job title is Head of Computing and IT, so I'm responsible for all the computer science education in the school, all the way, from 5 to 18. I wrote the course for all of that. And then I'm also responsible for all the IT deployment in the school, and I have certain other responsibilities like timetabling. I drive the school bus to PE sometimes. I do a whole range of things, and I kind of like being given that responsibility, but I also like having the opportunity to, if I have an idea and I want to do it, I have to persuade maybe 2 or 3 people to get it done, and I can do that quite easily. Whereas in a bigger school, the number of people you'd have to persuade to get an initiative started is potentially, far beyond, you might never even know the people that you have to persuade to get something approved. So for me, it's always been about that kind of level of control and bias towards action that is afforded you in a small setting like Cedars School.
That's true. So, and your kind of claim to fame is that you have brought technology into your schools. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
Tell me how, and we've discussed being in a small school setting. Was that an easier situation there? What's the educational climate there as far as are people receptive to technology in the schools? What's the struggle there?
It's an interesting question. I mean, technically speaking, what we did at Cedars, we were the first school in the world to go for a whole school one-to-one iPad deployment. We did that in August of 2010. And as part of being a small school gave us that opportunity because it was relatively easy for me to sort of brute force that technique for 100 pupils. I could do 100 devices. It took me 4 or 5 weeks in the first year to do it, but it was doable. Whereas if I had 1,000 pupils in the school, it would be more time than I would have had to try and just do such a thing so early in a device's life. Schools today, they have more techniques and more tools to help them do that at a bigger scale, but we didn't have that back then. But we didn't need it, which is why we could move kind of more quickly.
Yeah.
And I think overall, when you say are people receptive to technology and education, you've got to break down what you mean by people. Are students receptive to it? Absolutely. Are parents receptive to it? I believe high 80%, just immediate approval. I do a lot of work with other schools that are trying to bring in iPads, and I quite often go and speak at their parents' evenings or meetings about their program. And when they survey parents, every school I go to, I say, if you surveyed parents in those schools that have, almost always they report numbers of 85, 89, 90, 95% instant approval for technology programs in schools. And it's just a few percent they have to persuade. Are teachers receptive to technology in schools? Not as much as you would think. And I find it always surprises me that it's the teachers that don't want the change. Some teachers, don't get me wrong, absolutely want to see a much more technological basis for education in school, but there is a significant proportion of teachers who are deeply resistant to it, and it's not just the older teachers, which is what some people would often think. Do politicians and local authorities and the organisation, does the bureaucracy want technology in schools? Probably not, because they don't want to pay for it. And that's the bit that's very tricky right now. Although I kind of resist the notion that it's all about price, because we now live in a world where you can buy a laptop for $150. Just today, before we came on the air, Google announced new Chromebooks that are $150.
Yeah.
And, how much cheaper do we want it to be before we start doing it?
Yeah.
That was the thing about iPad 5 years ago was, well, it's so expensive. How could we possibly ever afford that? But we've had computers much cheaper than that for years, and people haven't flocked to them. So the enemy of this whole program is actually just doing nothing.
Well,
that's the main alternative.
And if you think about it, I mean, whenever there's a curriculum change and you need to get new books, I mean, those are not cheap books to purchase. And so then every time you have to change that curriculum, I mean, sometimes you end up spending just as much as that, or you end up with old curriculum that really is somewhat outdated. Whereas when you use something with the technology base to it, changing the curriculum or, getting an updated curriculum comes very easily. Is that the truth? Or
yeah, I mean, one of the things that's probably worth noting is that the $250 textbook problem is a very American problem. Our textbooks don't cost anything like that. So a lot of the justification for iPad programs in the US is indeed exactly what you've just articulated, Rebecca, which is we're spending so much in textbooks that we can buy this technology and it will save us money. Whereas in Scotland, that's not the case. That I heard somebody mention recently at a conference, they said, we never even managed to get one-to-one textbooks in schools in Scotland, so how are we ever going to do computers? But our textbooks cost, between £8 and £15, so about $15 to $20. So we don't have that kind of luxury of having already a high overhead for educational materials. But I completely agree with you that one of the great advantages of having this technology in your hands is that you can bring your lessons up to date instantly. If something happens that morning, I can pivot and I can teach that in the afternoon if I want to. And I do that all the time now. And it brings the lessons right up to date and deeply relevant for the kids, which is very powerful.
That's interesting.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors.
Hey, Firestarters, are you looking for a new way to listen to the Luminous Mind? Try listening on Stitcher. Haven't heard of Stitcher? Think of it as radio on demand. You can listen to the Luminous Mind anytime, anywhere. There is no downloading, no syncing, no wasted memory. Just stream your favorite podcasts such as the Luminous Mind. Stitcher is available on iOS, Android, Nook, iPad, and also from your favorite internet browser. Don't have Stitcher? Download it free today at Stitcher.com or in the App Store. And make sure you rate and review the Luminous Mind, so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Fraser Speirs, educational technology pioneer.
So how did your paradigm and educational philosophy change over time? We didn't really get into your own personal educational experience, but, how has that changed?
Yeah, so my background is in software engineering and computer science. And I previously have worked in systems administration jobs. I worked on supervising computer deployments for the Large Hadron Collider, the big super collider in the CERN laboratory in Geneva. I wasn't at Geneva, but I was doing it from Glasgow as part of a distributed system. And then I moved into education. And I suppose, when I started teaching, all I did was teach computer science. I didn't really have an educational philosophy at the time. I was just trying to kind of figure out what I was doing, But I think over time, I've kind of developed an idea that one of the things that I really care about is relevance, the relevance of school in the modern world. And I think that in many cases, schools are running the risk of becoming just complete dinosaurs. And there are certainly schools all over the UK where all kinds of strange practices go on, such as complete bans on all technology in the school grounds. We have situations where, that there are deposit boxes at the door of the classroom where kids have to put their mobile phone into the box, things like that. And you know exactly what happens there. I mean, I don't know if you're a fan of The Wire, but what they do in these schools is they buy burner phones like the drug dealers in the show The Wire, and they put these fake mobile phones in the box and they put their real smartphone in their pocket, So kids are just finding ways around this, always up. And I think that one of the things that I care about very deeply with our program is that we keep it relevant to the real world. We look at how is the world, how are we adopting as a developed Western society, how are we adopting technology? And when I look at that, what I see is not just one computer per person, but multiple. If you think about it, you've got a laptop, you've probably got a smartphone, you might have a tablet, pretty soon you're going to have a smartwatch. And this is why the cloud is such a big deal even for consumers now, is because the cloud is what binds together the 4, 5, 6, 7 computers that we all own. And, we're talking about being one-to-one as a school and that being a very advanced thing. But in fact, we are actually only just catching up with what society did, 15, 20, almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah, well, and when kids are excited about technology and then you take that away and make them sit in an antiquated classroom for 6 hours, I can't imagine very much learning coming in. When we talked about not having a personal educational philosophy, I think many of us do. It's that nostalgia that we have around our own education.
Yeah, my philosophy is it needs to be the exact same as what my school was like. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's why some of those schools don't change, is there is a nostalgia about it, especially I would imagine, I'm just guessing, in England, or in the UK, where you've got a rich history that goes back centuries, that you can end up creating that nostalgia and not moving in the direction that's best for the child.
You're right. I mean, Scotland essentially invented universal education for the whole world.
Yeah.
We were one of the first countries ever to do it. And I think that tradition is a part of it. There's a massive political part as well.
Yeah.
One of the big differences between England and Scotland is that in England you have what are called free schools, where an individual school or a group of schools is given money from the government based on their pupil roll, and then it's up to them what they do. And in Scotland, we don't have that. We have our local area, our counties, if you like, they run all the schools. So there's kind of layers and layers of bureaucracy on top of that. So it's I suppose one of the other things that you could say is that I think it's increasingly clear to me that one of the biggest problems in education is there's a massive survivorship bias in the whole system, which is that the people who run education, the people who teach in schools, are the people who liked school and did well at school when they were at school.
That's an interesting
because if you think about it, you don't get to be a teacher if you failed everything at school, right? You have to have been a successful student at school, then been a successful university student, and then you get to be a teacher. So the only people who work in education are the people for whom traditional education worked in the first place.
Yeah, that's an interesting
thing to think. There's a huge problem, and I think if I had my way, I would probably set a minimum age for teachers, which is not 21. I would say go away and do another job for 10 years and come back minimum 30 years old and then be a teacher.
Yeah.
And I think that would bring a lot more perspective into education.
Well, and I talked to another guest that talked about how educators, and I don't mean to speak badly about them or anything, but they are people who aren't necessarily, they're not trained and have done well in that field. Like you said, they've gone up through the ranks. I mean, they're professional educators, they're professional at working the system like it's been worked, but they aren't people who have worked and been trained in that field that they're teaching. He actually talked about how he's not a certified teacher, but they'd bring him in all the time because he he'd been out and worked in that industry and was successful at it. Mm-hmm. And so they would bring him in all the time to teach these children about it. So is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, I particularly feel as very strongly in computer science that there's the computer science that I understand from the world, and then there's the version of computer science that I understand that I have to teach to meet the exam criteria. And those two things come and go in alignment, and sometimes they're in alignment and sometimes they're well out of alignment. I'll give you a good example of this, which is that a textbook that I bought in 2014, it was published in 2013, still made reference to a program called AppleWorks, which was Apple's Office suite from the 1990s. And in this book that was copyright 2013, it said, AppleWorks is a popular general purpose word processing package. And on the day I taught that page for the first time, AppleWorks, it was the 10th anniversary of the last ever update to AppleWorks. So this program had been discontinued for 10 years, and this textbook was still talking about it as if it was a thing. So, this is the kind of thing that, if you want to be innovative in education, all you have to do is be 15 years behind the times instead of 20 years behind the times.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to think about. So as an educator, what is the best advice that you've ever received?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I couldn't come up with a great answer for. I think on the first day I started teaching, I said to the head teacher, I said, well, what do I do here? And they just said, don't be sarcastic to the kids and be kind. And I have not always managed to do either of those things, but every day I walk into the classroom, I try and remember that, okay, this boy might be annoying me right now, but bear in mind that he has, a disabled brother at home or something, or this kid's just about to move house and his whole world's getting turned upside down, or his dad works away on the oil rigs and he's just left. Trying to remember all the backstories to all the students and work with them. One boy a couple of years ago he was in the process of trying to move house. His family were trying to move house for weeks and months, and his whole life was like packed up in boxes, and he kept kind of hanging about and going into my classroom at strange times like lunchtime and after school and stuff. And I was like, well, how come you're not going home, And he's like, they wouldn't really talk about it. And then I just remembered, oh yeah, if he goes home, it's just chaos. They can't get anything done. So at that point, I just said, well, just use my desk whenever you need, kind of thing. And that's, again, to go back to the kind of scale of the whole thing, that's what I like about working in small schools. I can know that information. I've got friends and colleagues who work in local secondary schools, and they're, every report card time, they're writing 230 reports. They have literally no idea who they're writing about in some cases. And I never have that situation arise because I know, not only do I know who I'm writing about, but I also know about what's going on in their life and how I can help them, and how I can be kind to them, and how I can make their school experience as good as I can make it.
Well, and like you said, it makes the education more relevant to what's going on, versus just being able to satisfy the mass of whatever the bureaucracy thinks you need to be doing. So
yeah, it can be personalized.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So what do you think about the socialization activities of your school, and what are they?
Well, I think the most important thing that we do at our school is that we have a very high ratio of adults to children. And that is not always true in schools, but I think it's so important because what it means, like just the kind of situation I just described, is that the relationship between the adults and the children in the school should be non-adversarial, if you know what I mean by that. Like it shouldn't be a conflict situation being in school. And we all work very hard to try and make that the case. It's not always. Sometimes students choose to make it confrontational, and that's the case, but we never try and make it confrontational.
So that maybe your students see you as a trusted figure, not somebody who's just there to get them in trouble. Is that what you're meaning by that?
That's exactly what I mean. That we can, that we can be involved to a certain extent in understanding their lives and their context of their life outside of school. And what that gives us the flexibility to do is, to really, work with families to help them. If a child has a serious, health issue, for example, we can build systems around to help that child. And I'm not saying we're the only school to do that, because obviously a lot of other schools do that as well. But being at that small scale does help that kind of thing. And I really believe that a high ratio of adults to children and a high level of involvement from the adults with the children. So it's not just, from the bell starts to the bell stops inside the classroom. That's when we interact, and then it's just the Wild West for the rest of the time at school, lunch times and playtimes. But that we have that interaction all the way through the day, talking to kids at lunchtime, going out to play with them, different things like that. And I think that situation really, really helps the whole life of the school. I think it's a completely different environment to most other situations that you might find yourself in.
Well, and you could probably head off problems and correct things quicker when you're a higher adult to child ratio, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not having to kind of, it doesn't have to escalate to some big event in order to figure out what's going on.
I'll give you an example. Just very recently, I was doing playground duty, and there was a child in the school who I knew had some issues at home, and this caused this child to sometimes just behave in a very unusual way. They don't have any diagnosis, they don't have a problem, but just the strains and pressures of their life would sometimes cause them to behave in a certain way. And I was thinking about him just before we went out, and I thought, well, I know that this might happen. So I watched to see what was going on, and this child started behaving in this particular way. And I was able to, before it got to a situation where something had happened, I was able to just take him aside and say, look, I'm going to tell you one time, what you're doing is not okay right now. And if you continue, we're going to do something else. And so I put him back in the playground, and then he continued, and I said, look, just go and sit inside for 5 minutes. Okay, I'm not sending you inside. I'm not sending you to the head teacher. I'm just saying, go inside, just get out of the situation for a few minutes, and that way we don't have to have a situation here. And it's that level of subtlety, I think, is something that I always try and bring to that kind of situation. I don't always do a great job of it, but I think it's a very important part of the life of the school.
Yeah, to kind of be a softer answer versus hard-nosed disciplinary. So we talked about some of the struggles that we have introducing technology into the schools. Do you have any other obstacles that you face and maybe struggles that you've had, and then tell us what you've learned from them? I've
been very fortunate, I think, to have excellent colleagues who are very enthusiastic about new initiatives in the school. I think one of the things, when people come to our school and they look at our iPad program and they think that all of the work that went into getting this program to be as good as it is started on the first day we got our iPads, or started when we started planning our iPads. And what I've increasingly started describing to people is that before we ever thought about iPad, I spent 10 years building not just a reputation for myself, but a culture of understanding about computers in the school. That meant that when iPad came along, we were ready to step into that. The bit that people don't see is the 10 years when we had desktop computers that always worked, and then we had laptop computers that always worked, and we had Wi-Fi and internet that always worked. And building up that kind of culture of competence and service delivery, if you want to put it in a kind of business-like way, that prepares you to step over onto those things. So in some ways, the obstacle is really the amount of time and effort you have to put in. I think unless you have really dedicated people, not just from the technical side like me, but also people dedicated to thinking about how they teach, and being open to changing how they teach as well, that's the biggest obstacle. And as we've kind of gone through the iPad program, we've realized, some of us maybe more than others, that we have to change what we teach and how we teach it, as well as what we teach it with. And is having that flexibility all around, and trying not to get constrained by whatever external curricula are set, or the exam system. Those are some of the biggest kind of immovable obstacles right now, is the externally imposed constraints like the exam system, which is a challenge. But I think it's one that we've kind of gone through a period of being not depressed about it, but just kind of feeling a bit grounded by the fact that here's a set of standards that we're being given that don't quite match up with all the standards that we've sort of developed for ourselves. But I think we can resolve them. It's going to take us a couple of years to get it right, but I think we can resolve them, and we can really smooth that out over time.
Well, and I love how you talked about, to get people on board with technology, you got to make sure it works really well. I know, as soon as you come up against hiccups with technology, sometimes people who aren't as comfortable with it are ready to go, okay, see, this doesn't work,
Yeah.
So making sure that you've got somebody in there that really knows how to work the technology, that must be a very important part of being able to implement it.
I think it is. But also, a lot of schools come to iPad, and it's kind of like their Hail Mary pass. It's like the last thing. We know the Wi-Fi is terrible. We know the laptops were terrible. We know the desktop suite was terrible before. But trust us, this time it's going to be great. And a lot of people are pretty skeptical about it. It's not so much that and it kind of comes out as, I'm skeptical about the iPad. But in fact, what they're skeptical about is their organization's ability to execute a new technology plan. And that's actually a bigger discussion than just, is the iPad better than a Chromebook? Or should we have PCs? Or should we use Word or Google Docs? It's not that as much as, are we sure that we as an organization have the capacity to execute this plan? And that's a bigger question than many schools really ask themselves.
So you don't want to have technology in the school and not actually be able to implement it in. Is that what you're saying? Like, it's great to have it there and mess around on it, but like you're saying, to actually use it as a teaching tool. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, you're right. I really strongly believe that if you want to implement an iPad program properly, it's got to be led by the senior managers in the school. I've been in situations where I've been talking to, a classroom teacher, and they've been tasked with the iPad program, and the head teacher doesn't care. And that never works. That never, ever works. But that's true of every kind of school improvement program, is that it has to be led by the senior people in the school. And teachers have to have confidence that if they invest time and effort in learning this platform, learning a new way of teaching, that they're going to get the payoff, that that's going to be the way the school works, rather than we do a pilot program and, okay, it was great, but then we decide not to do it or something like that. And I invested a whole lot of time in learning how to do that and redeveloping lessons, and then we don't actually have iPads after all. So you've got to give people a lot of confidence, and that's a real leadership problem. It's not just a technology problem.
Well, and if you have good leadership, then maybe you'll get everybody trained correctly on it, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of just whoever feels like, oh, I want to use this in my classroom, they go get trained by themselves. You're saying that the leadership actually gets everyone moving in that same direction.
Yeah, and it's also about aligning the rest of the school, the life of the school, behind the technology program, so that it's kind of built into everything. It's not just, well, we use it for this or we use it for that. And this becomes a problem when a school district or a school demands a plan for action before they buy the technology. And I'm not saying you shouldn't think about what you do, but quite often if you say we're buying the iPads because we want to improve literacy in the school, then all people ever use the iPads for is literacy in the school. And in fact, there are so many second-order effects of having computers in the school that could be realized. But if you focus it down to just as one thing, then that's all that ever happens. But quite often, if you say, well, the whole school is going iPad, here are 5 main targets, but we'll see what else comes along. And that was what we did, and it became a real whole school project for the first 3 years. It's a lot more embedded now, so it's not really the focus of the school anymore, which is great. But for that time it was, and it was the major development process in the whole school's life.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't really think about that. You've got to not classify it for one thing in order to have it work.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Be sure to listen tomorrow so you can hear the rest of my interview with Fraser Speirs. To learn more about Fraser, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Also, be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list so you can receive notifications for our weekly audio blog, The Spark. We would love to have you join our program. Do so by going to the scheduling tab and become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website, theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.